"Take her," her father said without looking at her, as if even eye contact would make the decision harder. And Elena Whitmore understood in that quiet, suffocating moment that she was no longer a daughter, no longer a person, but a solution to a problem measured in dollars and land and debts that had nothing to do with her. The carriage waiting outside was already running, its wheels cutting shallow lines into the frost-covered gravel, and no one spoke as she stepped into it. Not her mother, not the servants who had watched her grow, not even the wind that seemed to hold its breath as the door shut behind her, sealing her fate with a hollow, final sound. The journey stretched for miles through a gray winter afternoon, the sky low and heavy, pressing down like a warning, and Elena sat with her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight despite the tremor that threatened to betray her. She would not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing, that dignity was the only thing no one could take unless she surrendered it herself. By the time the carriage reached Blackthorn Estate, night had already begun to fall, the mansion rising from the earth like something carved from shadow and stone, its tall windows dim with candlelight, its presence cold and unmoving as if it had been waiting for her long before she was born. The iron gates opened without a sound, and the carriage rolled forward into a world that felt separate from everything she had known. The doors were opened by a silent line of staff dressed in dark uniforms, their expressions carefully blank, their eyes lowered as though acknowledging something inevitable rather than welcoming a guest. Elena stepped down, the cold air biting through her thin gloves, but she did not hesitate. She walked forward into the grand hall where the ceilings stretched impossibly high and the walls seemed to absorb every sound. A single chandelier burned above, its light steady but distant, and at the far end of the room stood a man who did not move to greet her. Duke Sebastian Blackthorn was exactly as the whispers had promised, tall, still, his presence commanding the space without effort, his dark coat blending into the shadows behind him, his gaze sharp enough to make lesser people falter. But Elena did not look away, not when his eyes settled on her as if measuring her worth in a single glance, not when the silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of test. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, carrying across the stone floor without force. "You were given to settle a debt," he said, not unkindly, but without warmth, as though stating a fact that required no emotion. Elena inclined her head just slightly, acknowledging the truth without accepting its weight. "I understand, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady, and something flickered in his expression, so brief it could have been imagined, because she had not begged, had not trembled, had not tried to convince him she was worth more than the price paid for her. And in a house where everything was defined by control and power, that quiet refusal to break felt like the first crack in something neither of them yet understood. The servants did not speak to her, not when they took her cloak, not when they led her through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath dim candlelight, and not when a door was opened to reveal the room that would now belong to her. A chamber far too large for a single person, with tall windows framed by heavy curtains and a bed that looked untouched, as though no one had truly lived within these walls for years. Elena stepped inside without hesitation, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, and when the door closed behind her, the silence pressed in from all sides, thick and watchful. She moved toward the window, her fingers brushing the cold glass as she looked out over the dark grounds, the estate sprawling beyond sight, vast and controlled, just like the man who ruled it. Somewhere in this house, he was still awake. She could feel it, a presence as steady as the stone beneath her feet, and yet he had already dismissed her, reduced her to a transaction completed, a problem solved. But something in the way he had looked at her lingered, not curiosity, not interest, something sharper, as though he had expected her to break and found himself unsettled when she did not. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and a young maid entered, carrying a tray with tea that steamed faintly in the dim light, her hands trembling just enough to be noticed. "If you require anything, miss," the girl said quietly, her eyes lowered, and Elena inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Thank you," she replied, her voice gentle, and that was all. No questions, no demands, because she had learned that survival often began with observing before speaking. The maid hesitated for a fraction of a second, as though surprised by the absence of fear, or entitlement. Before retreating quickly, leaving Elena alone once more, the hours passed slowly, marked only by the faint ticking of a clock somewhere beyond the walls. And though exhaustion weighed on her, sleep did not come easily, not in a place where every shadow seemed to hold a memory. It was not until the deep quiet of night that a sudden sound broke the stillness, a distant commotion echoing faintly through the corridor, voices hushed but urgent, and without thinking, Elena stepped out of her room. Her bare feet silent against the cold floor as she followed the sound, it led her to a side hall where a servant had collapsed near the base of a staircase, a tray overturned beside him, untouched glassware scattered but unbroken. Two others stood frozen nearby, unsure, afraid to act without permission, and for a brief moment, Elena saw the invisible rule that governed this house. Do not move unless commanded, do not act unless told. But she did not belong to that rule, not yet. She crossed the distance without hesitation, kneeling beside the man, her movements calm, steady. She reached for his wrist, feeling the faint pulse beneath her fingers. He needs water and space, she said softly, not raising her voice, not commanding, simply stating what was needed. And something in her certainty broke the stillness. The other servants moved, one rushing to fetch water, the other stepping back. And as Elena adjusted the man's position, her expression remained composed, focused, as if she had done this many times before, as if care was something she gave without calculation. And from the shadowed end of the corridor, unseen by all but the flicker of candlelight, the Duke stood watching, silent, his gaze fixed not on the fallen servant, but on the woman who had been brought into his home as a burden and yet moved as though she belonged nowhere but exactly where she was needed. And for the first time in years, something unfamiliar stirred beneath his carefully controlled stillness. The man regained consciousness slowly, his breathing uneven but steady beneath Elena's careful watch. And when he finally opened his eyes, confusion flickered across his face before relief softened it, as though he had expected to be ignored rather than helped. Elena withdrew her hand at once, not lingering, not claiming any credit. She simply nodded once to the others who now stood ready, and rose to her feet with quiet grace, as if what she had done required no recognition, only completion. Take him somewhere warm, she said gently, her voice carrying just enough authority to be followed. And they obeyed, not because of rank, but because of certainty, the kind that did not need to be spoken twice. She turned to leave, intending to return to the silence of her room, but the faint shift of air behind her stopped her steps. She did not startle, did not turn too quickly. Instead, she allowed herself a single breath before facing him. Duke Sebastian Blackthorne stood a few feet away, his presence filling the corridor as naturally as the stone walls themselves, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that was no longer distant, no longer dismissive. There was something else now, something sharper, as if he had just seen a detail that did not fit into the world he controlled. You act without permission, he said, his voice low, not angry, but measured. Elena met his gaze without challenge, without submission. He needed help. She replied simply, and the answer hung between them, unembellished, undeniable. For a moment, neither moved. The candles flickered, casting shifting shadows across the walls, and in that quiet, the usual balance of power felt subtly altered, not broken, but questioned. Sebastian's eyes narrowed slightly, not in displeasure, but in thought, as though he were reassessing something he had already decided. This house has rules, he said after a moment, and Elena inclined her head, acknowledging the truth without retreating from it. Then perhaps the rules should allow for mercy, she said softly, the words spoken without defiance, yet impossible to ignore. Silence followed again, longer this time, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Sebastian studied her as one might study a rare and unexpected phenomenon, not with warmth, but with focus. She did not tremble, did not look away, did not attempt to soften herself to fit his expectations, and that absence of fear unsettled him more than any rebellion could have, because fear was something he understood, something he controlled, but this quiet steadiness offered him nothing to command. You are not here to change anything, he said finally, his tone colder now, as though restoring order required distance. Elena lowered her gaze then, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. No, Your Grace, she answered. I am here because I was sent, and there it was, the truth neither of them could deny. She belonged to this place by decision not her own, a fact that should have made her smaller, easier to dismiss. Yet as she turned to leave, her steps calm and unhurried, Sebastian found himself watching her in a way he had not intended, not as a burden delivered to his door, not as a transaction completed, but as a presence that disrupted the stillness he had carefully built around his life. And when she disappeared down the corridor, the silence that followed felt different, not empty, but altered, as if something had shifted beyond his control, something that would not easily return to what it had been before she arrived. Morning arrived without warmth, the pale light slipping through the tall windows as if reluctant to enter a place that had long forgotten what comfort felt like. Elena had not slept much, yet she rose early, dressing in the same quiet manner that had carried her through every uncertain moment of her life. She did not wait to be summoned, did not linger in the safety of her room. Instead, she stepped into the corridor with the same steady composure she had shown the night before, and already the house felt different. The servants moved with a subtle tension, their whispers softer, their glances more cautious, as though something unseen had shifted beneath the surface. Word traveled quickly in places like this, not through open conversation, but through the silence that followed an unexpected act. Elena felt their eyes on her as she passed, not hostile, not welcoming, simply unsure. She did not acknowledge it, because she understood that belonging was not something granted easily here. It was something observed, measured, and perhaps never fully given. The dining hall was vast, its long table set with precision. Though only one place was occupied, Duke Sebastian sat at the far end, a solitary figure framed by cold morning light, his posture straight, his attention fixed on the documents before him, as if the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. Elena paused only briefly before approaching, her steps quiet against the stone floor. She did not speak first, did not interrupt. Instead, she took her place at the opposite end of the table when indicated by a subtle gesture from a nearby servant. The distance between them stretched like an unspoken boundary, deliberate and exact. The meal was served in silence, the soft clink of silverware the only sound that dared to exist between them. And yet the quiet was not empty. It carried weight, observation, something unspoken that lingered just beneath the surface. Sebastian did not look up at first, but he was aware of her, every movement, every pause, every controlled breath. She did not fidget, did not attempt to fill the silence, and that absence of discomfort was itself a presence he could not ignore. Finally, he set aside the paper in his hand, his gaze lifting to meet hers across the length of the table. You seem unaffected, he said, his tone even, but his words precise, as though testing a theory rather than making a statement. Elena met his eyes without hesitation. By what? Your Grace, she asked softly, and for a brief moment, something like interest flickered in his expression, not because of the question, but because of how it was asked, not defensive, not uncertain, simply direct. By your circumstances, he replied, and the words hung there, stripped of decoration. Elena lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in thought, choosing her answer with care. Circumstances changed nothing about who I am, she said after a moment, her voice calm, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Sebastian leaned back slightly, studying her as if she were a puzzle that refused to resolve. Most would have spoken of fear, of loss, of injustice, but she offered none of those, only a quiet statement of self that did not bend under pressure. And in a world where everything could be bought, controlled, or taken, that kind of certainty was unfamiliar, even dangerous. You speak as though you have already accepted this place, he said, and there was something sharper beneath his words now, something probing. Elena shook her head once, a small, deliberate motion. No, Your Grace, she replied. I simply understand that resisting it would not change it. And again, the truth settled between them. Undeniable. Sebastian held her gaze for a long moment, longer than necessary, as if searching for a weakness that refused to reveal itself. And when he finally looked away, it was not dismissal that filled the space, but something quieter, something unresolved, because for the first time in years, he had encountered someone who did not fear him, did not challenge him, and yet did not belong to him either. And that unsettled the careful order he had built more than anything else could have the rest of the day unfolded with a quiet precision that seemed to define everything within Blackthorn Estate. Each hour marked not by clocks, but by routine, by expectation, by an unspoken understanding that nothing here happened without purpose. Elena observed it all without appearing to do so, the way the servants moved in measured steps, the way doors opened before being knocked upon, the way even silence seemed to carry rules of its own. She walked through the corridors slowly, not wandering, but learning, her fingers brushing lightly against the carved wood of a banister, the cool stone of the walls, grounding herself in a place that still felt like a memory she had not yet lived. And though no one stopped her, no one questioned her presence, there was a distance that remained, a boundary drawn not by words but by hierarchy, by the invisible lines that separated those who belonged from those who merely existed within the space. By afternoon, the sky had dimmed again, clouds gathering low and heavy beyond the tall windows, and Elena found herself in a quieter wing of the estate, where the air felt stiller, untouched, as if time had slowed within these walls. A single door stood slightly ajar, and though she had not intended to intrude, something about the stillness beyond it drew her forward, just enough to see. The room inside was preserved in a way that felt deliberate, not abandoned. A writing desk untouched, a chair positioned as though someone had only just stood from it, and on the far wall, partially veiled in shadow, a portrait hung, the faint outline of a woman visible beneath the dim light, her expression soft, her presence lingering in a way that did not belong to the past alone. Elena did not step inside. She understood instinctively that this was not a place meant to be entered, but as she turned to leave, a voice behind her broke the quiet. "You should not be here." Sebastian's tone was not raised, yet it carried enough weight to halt her immediately. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze without surprise, as if she had already sensed him before he spoke. "I did not intend to intrude," she said, her voice calm, and for a moment, something sharper flickered in his expression, not anger, but something closer to warning. He moved closer then, his steps measured, controlled, until he stood just within the threshold of the room, not entering, but guarding it. "This part of the house is not open to anyone," he said, and though the words were simple, the meaning beneath them was clear. This was not about rules, it was about something he had chosen not to let the world touch. Elena inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the boundary without question. "Then I will remember that," she replied, and she stepped back, giving the space the respect it demanded. But she did not rush away, did not retreat as though she had done something wrong, and that steadiness lingered again. Unexpected, Sebastian's gaze remained on her longer than necessary, as if waiting for something more, an apology, perhaps, or discomfort, but she offered neither, only quiet understanding, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because it did not fit into the order he knew how to control. "You are observant," he said after a moment, and the words were not praise, but recognition. Elena met his gaze. "It is the only way to understand a place like this," she answered, and again, the simplicity of it carried weight. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, but it was no longer empty. It held something new, something neither of them had named, and as Elena turned to leave, her steps steady, unhurried, he found himself watching her once more, not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as something that had begun to disturb the stillness of a house that had long been untouched by anything unexpected, and for the first time, that disturbance did not feel like a problem to be removed, but something he could not yet bring himself to ignore that night. The house seemed quieter than before, as though even the walls had withdrawn into themselves, holding secrets too heavy to echo. Elena remained in her room longer than she had the night before, not out of fear, but because something about the Duke's warning lingered in her thoughts, not the words themselves, but the way they had been spoken, controlled, deliberate, yet edged with something unguarded, something that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with loss. She moved to the small writing desk by the window, her fingers resting lightly on its polished surface as she stared out into the darkness beyond the glass. The ground stretched endlessly, untouched by movement, the trees standing still beneath a sky that offered no comfort. And for the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself a quiet breath that was not measured, not controlled, but simply human. She had been brought here as a solution, a burden exchanged for stability, and yet nothing about this place felt stable. It felt suspended, as if time itself had paused within these walls, held in place by something no one dared disturb. A faint sound broke through the silence, distant at first, then clearer, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the corridor outside her door. Elena did not move immediately. She listened, the rhythm steady, familiar now in a way she could not fully explain. And when the steps passed her door without stopping, she rose, not out of curiosity alone, but because something within her told her this was not a moment meant to be ignored. She stepped into the hallway, the cold air brushing against her skin as she followed the fading sound. It led her deeper into the estate, toward the quieter wing she had already learned to recognize, the one that held more silence than the rest, the one he had told her to avoid. She slowed as she approached, not crossing the boundary, not intruding, but remaining just beyond it. And there, through the faint glow of candlelight, she saw him. Sebastian stood alone in the room he had guarded so carefully, his back partially turned, his posture no longer rigid, no longer controlled in the way he presented himself to the rest of the world. He stood before the portrait, the same one she had glimpsed earlier, and though she could not see his expression clearly, something in the stillness of his figure spoke louder than any words. This was not the Duke who commanded an estate. This was a man standing before something he could not command, could not change. Elena did not step closer, did not make a sound. She understood instinctively that this moment was not meant for interruption, and yet she could not turn away either, because in that quiet, she saw something she had not expected, not power, not control, but absence, the kind that lingered long after something had been lost. After a moment, Sebastian's voice broke the silence, low, almost indistinguishable from the quiet itself. "You should not be here," he said again. But this time, the words lacked the sharpness they had carried before. Elena did not retreat immediately. Instead, she spoke softly, careful not to disrupt the fragile stillness of the room. "I am not inside," she replied, and the truth of it settled gently between them. She had respected the boundary. Even now, Sebastian remained still for a moment longer, as if deciding whether to dismiss her or allow her presence to remain. And then, slowly, he turned, his gaze meeting hers across the threshold. There was no anger in his expression, only something distant, something that had not yet fully returned to the mask he wore for the rest of the world. "This house is not what it appears to be," he said, his voice quieter now, as if the walls themselves might hear him. Elena held his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Neither are the people within it," she answered, and for the first time, the silence that followed did not feel like a barrier, but like the beginning of something neither of them had intended, something that could not be undone once it had been seen. And as the candlelight flickered between them, the distance that had once defined everything in this house felt just slightly less absolute, as if a single step, not taken, had already begun to change it. The next morning did not bring answers, only a deeper quiet that seemed to settle into the very structure of the estate. Elena moved through the halls with the same calm presence, yet something had shifted within her, not fear, not uncertainty, but awareness. She had seen a side of the Duke that was never meant to be witnessed, and though no words had been spoken to acknowledge it, the knowledge remained between them like a fragile thread, one that could not be undone. The servants felt it too, though they did not understand it. Their glances lingered a fraction longer, their movements slightly more cautious in her presence, as if unsure whether she remained an outsider or something else entirely. By midday, a carriage arrived at the front of the estate, its wheels cutting sharply across the gravel, breaking the stillness with an unfamiliar urgency. Elena stood at one of the tall windows, her gaze steady as she watched the arrival. Two figures stepped out, dressed with the kind of precision that belonged to people who expected to be received, not questioned, and even from a distance, she recognized the posture, the confidence, the cold familiarity of a world she had left behind. Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition, because she knew without being told that they had not come by accident. The doors opened. Voices carried faintly through the hall, and moments later, a servant approached her, his expression carefully composed. "The Duke requests your presence," he said, and Elena inclined her head once. Her steps measured as she followed. She entered the drawing room without hesitation, and the moment she crossed the threshold, the past she had left behind stood waiting for her. Her father stood near the fireplace, his posture rigid, his expression controlled in a way that felt painfully familiar. Beside him, a man she did not know observed the room with quiet calculation. But it was not them that held her attention. It was Sebastian, standing across from them, his presence as composed as ever, yet something in the set of his shoulders felt different, more deliberate, as if he had already anticipated this moment. Elena came to a stop, her gaze briefly meeting her father's before returning to the Duke, and in that single glance, everything that had once defined her place in the world was reduced to something distant, something she no longer belonged to. "You did not inform me you would be receiving visitors," Sebastian said, his voice calm, but edged with something sharper. Her father shifted slightly, offering a measured nod. "We believed it best to come in person," he replied, his tone smooth, practiced. "There are matters that require clarification." Elena remained silent, her presence acknowledged but not addressed, as though she were still an object being discussed rather than a person within the room. And yet something about that felt different now, less absolute than it had before. "The arrangement has already been fulfilled," Sebastian said, his gaze unwavering, and the words were final. But her father did not retreat. "Arrangements can be reconsidered," he answered, and the implication settled heavily in the air. Elena felt it then, not fear, not even anger, but the quiet realization that she had not been sent away as a conclusion, but as a transaction that could still be undone if it served a greater purpose. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, the only sign of the shift within her, and before she could speak, before she could decide whether she would allow herself to be moved once more without choice, Sebastian stepped forward, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "She is not something to be reclaimed at convenience," he said, and the room stilled, not because of the words alone, but because of the way they were spoken, not as a dismissal, but as a declaration. And for the first time since her arrival, Elena felt the balance shift in a way that could not be ignored, because whatever she had been before, whatever she had been sent here as, something had already begun to change, and it was no longer entirely within anyone else's control. The silence that followed his words did not break immediately. It settled instead, heavy and deliberate, pressing against every person in the room as though waiting to see who would move first. Elena felt it in the stillness of her own breath, in the way her father's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, as if the balance he had relied upon had shifted in a way he had not anticipated. "You misunderstand," her father said at last, his voice controlled, but no longer entirely certain. "She was never meant to remain here permanently." And though the words were directed at the Duke, they landed somewhere between them, as if attempting to redefine something that had already begun to change. Sebastian did not respond immediately, his gaze steady, unwavering, not on the man who spoke, but on Elena herself, and that alone altered the weight of the moment, because for the first time, she was not being spoken about as though she were absent. She was being seen, fully, deliberately. "And yet she is here," he said quietly, and the simplicity of it carried more authority than any argument could have. The other man in the room shifted slightly, stepping forward with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "Surely, Your Grace, you understand the nature of such arrangements," he said, his tone smooth, practiced. "Circumstances change. Priorities evolve." Elena felt the words as something familiar, something she had lived within for years, the constant reshaping of decisions made without her voice. And yet now, standing within this room, something about that expectation no longer fit as easily as it once had. Sebastian's expression did not change, but there was a subtle tightening in his gaze, a quiet refusal to accept the premise being offered. "I understand precisely," he replied, his voice calm, but edged with something firmer now, "which is why I do not alter terms once they are set." The statement was not raised, not forceful, but it settled into the space with a finality that could not be mistaken. Elena's father exhaled slowly, as though recalibrating. "You are a reasonable man," he said. "You must see that keeping her serves no real purpose." And there it was, spoken plainly, the truth he had always believed, that she held no value beyond the function she fulfilled. Elena did not react outwardly, but something within her stilled, not wounded, not surprised, simply acknowledged, because she had known this long before it was spoken aloud. And yet before the silence could deepen into something more final, Sebastian moved, a single step forward, small, but unmistakable, placing himself not in front of Elena, not shielding her, but aligning himself with a position that no longer treated her as separate from the decision being made. "On the contrary," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "Her presence has already proven to be of value." The room seemed to shift again, the words unexpected not because of their content, but because of their implication. Elena's gaze lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in quiet awareness. She did not look at her father, did not seek his reaction, because something more important had already changed. She was no longer waiting to be defined by his decision. The man beside her father gave a faint, almost amused smile. "Value can be reassigned," he said lightly. "There are other arrangements that could be made." And for a brief moment, the old pattern threatened to reassert itself, the negotiation, the exchange, the quiet dismissal of her presence as something interchangeable. But this time, it did not settle the same way, because Sebastian's expression did not yield. His gaze remained steady, fixed, and when he spoke again, there was no room left for reinterpretation. "She is not available for reassignment," he said, and the words were not spoken loudly, but they carried a weight that closed the space around them. And in that moment, Elena felt something she had not expected, not relief, not safety, but a shift in position, subtle, yet undeniable, as if for the first time, she was no longer being moved within someone else's design, but standing within a choice that had already begun to form around her, one that neither her past nor her circumstances could easily undo. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because there are moments when words lose their function and silence becomes the only thing strong enough to carry what has already been decided. Elena stood where she was, her hands still, her posture unchanged, yet something within her had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Her father's expression hardened slightly, not with anger, but with calculation, the kind that had shaped every decision he had ever made. "You place unnecessary weight on a matter that was never meant to hold it," he said carefully, his tone measured, attempting to regain control of a situation that had quietly slipped beyond his reach. Sebastian did not respond at once. His gaze remained steady, not confrontational, but immovable, as though the outcome had already been decided long before this conversation began. "Weight is determined by value," he said after a moment, his voice calm, yet final, and the words settled into the room with a clarity that left no space for negotiation. Elena felt them as something unfamiliar, not because she did not understand them, but because they had never before been applied to her. The man beside her father shifted again, his composure beginning to thin beneath the stillness that now defined the room. "You speak as though she holds significance," he said, a faint edge of disbelief beneath his controlled tone, and for a brief moment, the old world pressed in again, the one where her existence was measured only by utility, by what she could offer, by what she could be exchanged for. Elena did not look at him, did not defend herself, because she had learned that value argued was value diminished. Instead, she remained still, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Sebastian's expression did not change, but there was something quieter now, something that had nothing to do with the men before him and everything to do with the woman standing behind him. "Significance is not always visible to those who refuse to see it," he said, and though the words were not directed at her, Elena felt them as though they had been, not as praise, not as protection, but as recognition. The room fell silent again, heavier this time, because there was nothing left to contest without revealing too much. Her father exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward Elena, not with warmth, not with regret, but with the distant acknowledgement of a decision that no longer belonged to him. "Very well," he said at last, his voice quieter now, less certain than before. If you insist on keeping her, then the matter is concluded. The words were meant to close the conversation, to restore some measure of control, but they lacked the authority they once would have carried, because something had already changed, something that could not be undone by simple agreement. Sebastian inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the end of the exchange without offering anything further, and with that, the tension that had held the room in place began to ease, not completely, but enough for movement to return. The men turned, their departure as controlled as their arrival had been, but the absence they left behind felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Elena remained where she was until the doors closed, until the sound of the carriage faded into the distance, and only then did she allow herself a single breath that was not measured, not restrained, just real. She did not look at Sebastian immediately, because she understood that something had just occurred that could not be reduced to simple gratitude or acknowledgement, and when she finally lifted her gaze, he was already looking at her, not with distance, not with indifference, but with something that had not been there before, something quieter, more dangerous, because it was not rooted in control, but in awareness. "You did not speak," he said, his voice lower now, no longer meant for the room, only for her. Elena met his gaze, her expression steady. "It was not my place to decide," she replied, and the truth of it settled between them, simple, undeniable, and yet insufficient to explain what had just taken place. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, as though searching for something beneath the surface, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something different, something that had not been present before. "And if it had been," he asked quietly, "would you have chosen to stay?" The question lingered, not as a demand, but as something far more uncertain, and for the first time since she had arrived, Elena did not answer immediately, because the truth was no longer as simple as it had once been, and somewhere in that hesitation, something new began to take shape, something neither of them had expected, and neither could ignore. The question did not fade. It remained between them, quiet yet unrelenting, as though the air itself refused to let it pass unanswered. Elena held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but something within her shifted, not uncertainty, not fear, but the recognition that this moment was different from all the others that had come before it, because for the first time, the choice was not being made around her, it was being placed before her, and that alone altered everything. She drew a slow breath, steady, deliberate, as if measuring the weight of something she had never been allowed to hold. "I do not know," she said finally, her voice soft, but clear, and the honesty of it settled deeper than any certain answer could have. Sebastian did not look away, though something in his expression changed, not disappointment, not surprise, but something quieter, something that suggested he had not expected certainty, only truth, and she had given it. The silence stretched again, but it no longer felt like distance. It felt like something forming, fragile, undefined, and yet impossible to ignore. "You should," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, stripped of the authority it usually carried, as though the words belonged more to the man than the duke. "A person should always know where they choose to stand." Elena's gaze did not waver, but her hands stilled at her sides, because she understood what he meant, not as instruction, but as something deeper, something he himself had not yet resolved. "And do you know where you stand?" she asked quietly, and the question, simple as it was, shifted the balance once more, because it did not challenge him, it did not accuse. It only reflected the same uncertainty he had placed before her. Sebastian's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in thought, as though the answer was not as immediate as it should have been. "I stand where I have always stood," he replied. But there was a pause before the words, a fraction of a moment that revealed more than the answer itself. Elena inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the response without accepting it as complete. "Then why ask me to choose differently?" she said, and again, the quiet truth of her words carried more weight than any argument. The room felt smaller. Somehow, not in space, but in distance, as though the space between them had shifted without either of them moving. Sebastian studied her in silence, longer this time, as if searching for something he could not yet define, and for the first time since she had arrived, There was no clear answer in his gaze, no immediate judgment, only consideration, and something else beneath it, something unfamiliar. Because you are not bound to this place by the same reasons, he said finally, his voice quieter now, more measured. You were sent here. Elena held his gaze, her expression steady. And yet you chose to keep me. She replied, and the words lingered, not as accusation, but as acknowledgement, because that choice, whether he admitted it or not, had already been made. Sebastian did not respond immediately, his silence deeper now, more deliberate, as though the truth of it had settled into a place he could not easily dismiss. And in that silence, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the house, but between them, something that no longer resembled a transaction, no longer fit within the boundaries that had defined her arrival. This house does not change, he said after a long moment, his voice returning to something steadier, more familiar. It remains what it has always been. Elena's gaze softened slightly, not with emotion, but with understanding. Perhaps, she said quietly, but the people within it do. And the words, simple as they were, settled into the space between them with a quiet certainty, because whether either of them was ready to admit it or not, something had already begun to change, something that could not be undone simply by returning to what had come before. And as the silence followed, it no longer felt like something that separated them, but something that held them both in a moment neither had expected, and neither could easily leave behind. The rest of the day passed without further mention of the conversation, yet its presence lingered in every quiet corner of the estate, like a shadow that could not be dismissed simply by turning away from it. Elena moved through the halls with the same calm precision, but her awareness had deepened, sharpened by something she could not easily name. It was no longer just observation. It was recognition of the space, of the people, and of herself within it. And for the first time, that awareness did not feel like something imposed upon her, but something she carried by choice. The servants responded to her differently now, not openly, not with words, but with subtle shifts, a hesitation before turning away, a glance that lingered just a moment longer than before, as though they were beginning to see her not as someone passing through, but as someone who might remain. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared slightly, pale light stretching across the grounds, and Elena found herself drawn outside. The cold air crisp against her skin as she stepped beyond the heavy doors. The estate extended before her in quiet expanse, the gardens carefully maintained yet untouched by anything resembling warmth, as if beauty here existed only in structure, not in life. She walked slowly along the stone path, her breath steady, her thoughts quieter than they had been since her arrival, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to exist without the weight of expectation, without the silent calculations that had once defined every step she took. A sound behind her broke the stillness, measured footsteps approaching across the gravel, and though she did not turn immediately, she knew who it was before he spoke. You chose to come outside, Sebastian said, his voice carrying easily through the open air. Elena turned then, meeting his gaze without surprise. The house felt too still, she replied, and the word lingered between them, more meaningful than it appeared, because stillness in that place was not peace. It was something held in place, something unresolved. Sebastian regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable, but his presence less distant than it had been before. And you believe the outside is different? He asked, not dismissive, but curious in a way he had not allowed himself to be until now. Elena glanced briefly across the grounds, her gaze thoughtful. It is not, she said, but it breathes differently. And again, the simplicity of her words carried something deeper, something that reached beyond the surface of what was seen. Sebastian's gaze followed hers for a moment, as though considering the space through her perspective rather than his own, and for the first time in a long while, the estate did not feel entirely fixed in his understanding. You speak as though you are already part of it, he said after a moment. Elena looked back at him, her expression steady. Perhaps I am beginning to understand it, she replied, and the distinction mattered, because understanding was not the same as belonging, but it was the first step towards something that could not be undone once it had begun. Sebastian studied her in silence, the wind shifting slightly between them, carrying with it the faint scent of winter and something quieter beneath it, something that did not belong to the cold. Understanding does not always lead to acceptance, he said, his tone softer now, less guarded. Elena held his gaze, unflinching. No, she agreed, but it changes how you stand within it. And once again, her words settled into the space between them with a quiet certainty that left no need for further explanation. Sebastian did not respond immediately, and in that silence, something became clear, not through words, but through the absence of them, because for the first time, he was not correcting her, not dismissing her, not placing distance between them. He was simply listening, and as they stood there, the cold air moving around them, the estate stretching beyond in silent witness, the line that had once separated them felt less defined, not erased, but altered, as if both of them had stepped, without fully realizing it, into a place where the rules that had once governed everything no longer held the same authority. And in that quiet shift, something new began to take shape, something neither of them had intended, and neither could now deny. The days that followed did not return to what they had been. Though nothing openly declared the change, it existed instead in the quiet spaces, in the way conversations paused when Elena entered and resumed with a different tone, in the way the staff no longer avoided her gaze entirely, but met it briefly, uncertain, as though acknowledging something they could not yet name. And most of all, it existed in the presence of the Duke himself, not in what he said, but in what he no longer dismissed. Elena moved through the estate with the same calm composure. Yet she was no longer simply observing. She was participating in ways so subtle they could not be easily defined. A word spoken at the right moment, a gesture offered without expectation, a presence that did not demand attention yet altered the atmosphere around it. And though she did not seek to change anything, change followed her quietly, as if drawn to something within her that refused to bend or break. One evening, as the light faded and the halls settled into their familiar stillness, Elena found herself once again near the quieter wing of the estate, not out of curiosity this time, but because she no longer avoided it. She paused just before the threshold, not crossing, but standing where she could see the faint glow of candlelight within. And after a moment, she stepped back, choosing not to enter, not because she feared the boundary, but because she respected what it held. As she turned to leave, a voice stopped her. "You do not come inside," Sebastian said, his tone quieter than it had ever been. Elena turned, meeting his gaze. "It is not mine to enter," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice, only understanding. Sebastian regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, yet something in it had softened, not visibly, but in a way that altered the space between them. "Most would be tempted," he said, and there was something beneath the words, not accusation, not warning, but something closer to curiosity. Elena held his gaze, her answer simple. "Most would not understand what they see." And again, her words carried more weight than their simplicity suggested, because understanding had become the quiet thread that bound every moment between them. Sebastian exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, yet it shifted something in the silence. "You understand more than you should," he said, not as criticism, but as acknowledgement. Elena inclined her head slightly. "I understand what is shown," she replied, "and what is not." And for a moment, the distance between them felt impossibly small, not in space, but in something far less tangible, something neither of them had chosen, yet both had begun to accept. Sebastian stepped closer then, not enough to close the space entirely, but enough that his presence no longer felt separate from hers. "And what do you see?" he asked quietly, and the question lingered, not as a test, but as something deeper, something that had not been asked of anyone in a very long time. Elena did not answer immediately, her gaze steady, her expression thoughtful, because she understood that the truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. "I see a man who built walls strong enough to keep everything out," she said softly, "except what he could not let go." The silence that followed was different from all the others, heavier, more fragile, as though the air itself had shifted in response to something that could not be denied. Sebastian did not move, did not look away, and in that stillness, something within him seemed to settle, not into certainty, but into acknowledgement, because for the first time, Someone had seen beyond what he allowed, and had not turned away, and as the candlelight flickered between them, casting long shadows across the stone walls, the distance that had once defined everything between them no longer felt like something that needed to be maintained, but something that had already begun to fade, leaving behind a space neither of them fully understood. Yet neither could ignore the night settled over Blackthorn Estate with a stillness that no longer felt empty, but watchful, as though the house itself had begun to listen. Elena stood by the window of her room, her reflection faint against the glass, the darkness beyond stretching across the grounds like a quiet promise of something yet unresolved. She had not returned to the drawing room, had not sought out conversation, yet the words from earlier lingered within her, not as questions, but as truths that had already begun to take shape. She was no longer simply someone who had been sent here, she was someone who remained, and that distinction, though subtle, changed everything. A soft knock came at her door, unexpected at this hour, and when she opened it, she found not a servant, but Sebastian standing in the dim corridor, his presence as composed as ever. Yet there was something different in the way he stood, not distant, not guarded in the same way. "You are awake," he said, his voice quiet, as if the night itself required restraint. Elena stepped aside slightly, allowing the space between them to shift without fully inviting him in. "Sleep has not yet come," she replied, and the honesty of it required no further explanation. Sebastian did not enter, but he did not leave either, his gaze moving briefly past her, taking in the room, the stillness, before returning to her. "This house does not allow it easily," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried something more, something personal. Elena held his gaze, her expression steady. "Perhaps it is not the house," she said softly. "Perhaps it is what the house holds." And for a moment, the silence that followed felt different from all the others, because it was no longer uncertain, it was understood. Sebastian exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, yet it marked something shifting within him. "You see too much," he said. But there was no warning in his tone, no attempt to push her away, only acknowledgement. Elena did not deny it, because denial would have been untrue, and truth had become the one thing neither of them had begun to avoid. "And yet I remain," she answered, and the weight of those words settled between them, not as defiance, but as something far more significant, as choice. Sebastian's gaze held hers, longer than before, as if measuring something that no longer needed to be proven, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the distance it once had. "You were brought here as an obligation," he said quietly. "Something to be managed, contained." Elena did not look away. "I know," she replied, her voice steady, and there was no bitterness in it, only clarity. Sebastian stepped closer then, not enough to cross the boundary entirely, but enough that the space between them no longer felt like separation. "You are not that," he said, and the words, simple as they were, carried more weight than anything he had said before, because they were not spoken to the room, not spoken to define a transaction. They were spoken to her, and only her. Elena felt the shift in them, not as something overwhelming, but as something quiet and undeniable, and for the first time, she allowed herself to answer not from where she had been, but from where she now stood. "Then what am I?" she asked, softly, and the question lingered, not uncertain, but open. Sebastian's expression did not change immediately, but something in his gaze deepened, something that no longer belonged to the past he had held on to, but to the present standing before him. "The only thing in this house that was not taken from me," he said, his voice low, and the truth of it settled into the space between them with a quiet finality. And in that moment, the silence that followed was no longer something that separated them, it was something that held them both, steady, unspoken, and real. And though nothing more was said, nothing needed to be, because some things did not require declaration to be understood, they only required recognition, and in that recognition, something began, not loudly, not suddenly, but with the kind of quiet certainty that could not be undone, because some hearts did not learn to feel again through force or time, but through the presence of someone who saw them clearly and chose to remain anyway.